Welcome. I'm Russ Rapp, and we're going to do a live talk about non-duality. And the focus of this discussion right here, right now, is what is non-duality really? And it really came from some questions that a fellow traveler made on one of my other videos, asked a bunch of questions in regards to, is non-duality this or is it that? Like, what really is non-duality? And so that's going to be the focus of this video. So if you're new to non-duality, this is going to be a good one because I think I'm going to get into just the basics of it. So that will be something that you can maybe glean some idea of what the concept of non-duality is. And if you're very familiar with the subject, this could be something that will maybe open your mind to something you haven't considered before. But the thing about non-duality is it's descriptive versus prescriptive, meaning it's a way to define an aspect of reality or life. What is? It's a way to point to kind of an absolute truth of existence, and yet it's not something that really directly gives benefit or changes anything in your life as you see it. So if you're coming to this subject of non-duality to get something or to learn or to obtain something, ultimately you will be dissatisfied. With that being said, there is some aspects of this communication, of this discussion that we're having, that you may find value in, that has nothing to do with non-duality directly. Non-duality, what is ever present. And so it's something that always has, it's a part of everything essentially, and nothing. Kind of that dichotomy there, where nothing is really talked about in non-duality that directly connects to what it's trying to say. And so this is where the frustration of non-duality comes in, is when you start speaking about it using words. There's this circular logic, or it's the catch-22 of kind of saying the same things in different ways, or saying opposites and trying to combine them. It's like the Venn diagram where you have the two circles, and then there's a part where it overlaps in the middle, kind of like that, and you kind of look at the connection. Whereas when you're talking about non-duality, it's talking about two opposites that never really connect. It's the parabola of the infinite line that never quite reaches zero all the way to infinity. And so it's difficult in that respect, and it can be frustrating, but that's part of the deal of trying to control life and understand things that you can't ultimately understand as a separate individual. But before we get more into that, I just wanted to do a quick plug for Eagle Brook Church. I listened to their service this morning. And the series is, normal's not working, but this sermon today was specifically on anxiety and how to deal with anxiety and how that relates to a biblical understanding of anxiety. And I think it was very beneficial. So I think, a lot of people maybe come to the subject of non-duality looking for answers to solve their pain and suffering, or to rid themselves of this anxiety that they've been holding on to, or to travel lighter, as Paul Hederman would say. And so that's the focus that people come to non-duality. And even if non-duality itself is not really about changing anything, it can be used in a way to find relief in a sense, but it's not necessarily anything to do with non-duality and what non-duality is representing. So if you have struggles with anxiety, and full disclosure, I still struggle with, I guess you would call some general type of anxiety, whereas it's not necessarily ever about a specific subject, but it's about every subject. And so it's something that's been very familiar to me. And the reason part of the reason why I say that is people come to non-duality looking for the answer, looking for the messenger that has it all, the guru that knows the truth, that has the inner, the wisdom, the the esoteric knowledge that has been withheld or misunderstood by the general public, that you're seeking to find, that little piece, that nugget, that the holy grail that you want to discover so you can find peace. And yet it has nothing to do with you specifically or the guru that you seek. And if you're trying to find the validity of the message of non-duality through the package, through the representation of the messenger who's telling you the message, then it's just yet another distraction onto understanding the what non-duality is pointing to. Because you can never really understand it, because you're always going to spin a story on top of what non-duality is trying to get at. And so that's really the focus of this discussion, is kind of pointing to the thing that adds to the confusion, essentially, not to the thing that non-duality is actually being defined as. But I just wanted to plug the Eagle Brook Church because I found it to be helpful. And so if you're looking for a prescription or ways to look at life, or, outside of, if you need professional help, I don't have a degree in psychology and all that. So, if you need that, obviously seek professional help. But Eagle Brook Church, especially the sermon today, did a really good job at covering some of the issues that a lot of us deal with, especially nowadays in the times that we live. I think anxiety is a high level for various reasons. So you may connect with that as well. So I just wanted to plug that again. And I will add a link to that video in the description here, so you can have that and go to the one that I'm referring to. So as we go along, if you end up joining live during this talk, feel free to throw some questions or comments in the chat. I'll get to them at some point, hopefully. So let's talk about non-duality. What is non-duality really? So I've made hours and hours of video talking about a subject that can never really be fully grasped. And it's kind of a funny, ironic's the right word, or a cosmic joke to talk about things that, to speak of nothing. But non-duality isn't necessarily nothing, and I think we get confused with words. And so a lot of the focus of these talks center around, how are we defining things? How are we looking at things? Looking at how the mind works, looking at how our biases are set up, looking at our habits and how we react to life or react to our inner processes. But the reason why I like the topic of non-duality is it's, okay, so for the new people out there that aren't familiar with non-duality, I've said this in videos, or sometimes people kind of focus on, okay, so what does non-duality mean? What does non-dual mean? And I think it's a little bit what's the right word? I don't know what the right word is, but the word, if you look at the word itself, non means no or not, and then dual means two, so not two. It's like, okay, so that's the definition of non-duality. Well, yeah, I mean, who doesn't understand that? I mean, that's a pretty basic thing to kind of grasp. I mean, it's not like a word that we're not familiar with for the most part. So just to say not to doesn't really give anyone anything. And I think part of that's the purpose. But at the same time is when, if people are genuinely coming to this subject, wanting to understand what this concept of non-duality is, and you just say it means not to, it's like, okay, well, thanks for nothing. But that's ultimately, in the definition. And so in order to understand what that means or what that's getting at is to compare that to another term that means very similar thing, but said in a different way. And that would be the term of oneness. So on the one hand, you've got non-duality, and then on the other hand, you've got oneness. And in some respects, they're kind of saying the same thing, but but they're kind of going about it in a different route. So what's the difference between oneness and non-duality? I think part of it is, as humans, how we relate to it, what we do with it. And so it's the meaning that we give it. When you talk about oneness, you start with this idea that everything is one. And as a separate self, there's something that you can become. There's something that you can believe, essentially, that oneness exists, because before you understood the idea of oneness, you felt separate, alone, or you were a autonomous human being, somewhat disconnected from reality. There's self and other, inside, outside, that sort of thing. So then all of a sudden, this idea of oneness, we're all one, I'm no longer separate. When it's framed in that way, it becomes something that you believe. So you believe that there is this oneness that is something that exists. And so it becomes a thing, an object in and of itself. And so the oneness is something that you believe or connect to. So then everything is seen through the filter of this idea of oneness. And so when you see pain or suffering, or people treating others poorly, or, liars, deceivers, abusers, then there's a judgment within that as far as, well, they're not seeing things in the oneness mentality that I'm claiming to see or believe in. And so essentially it becomes a basic belief on how I see reality, which is not much different than any other belief, essentially. So you believe that there's this oneness. And so depending on your interpretation of oneness and that belief, you filter, you see the world in a certain way. You have a certain worldview, which can lend to other beliefs and other ideas about how the world is. And ultimately come down to another belief system, essentially. And so that's something that can either be true or not true, and something you can spend a lot of time focusing on. Whereas non-duality is kind of starting from the other end, saying that there is not two. There is no, so that which believes there to be two is an error. So it's focusing on the thing that wants to see itself as special, essentially. it's focusing on how the illusion or deception occurs in the first place. So it's more focused on what exists and pointing to that as a way to uncover or peel back the falseness or the illusion of those beliefs. And so instead of having your own beliefs that you start with and then adding this other idea of oneness on top of that, it's a negation. It's a way to take away or to remove beliefs. So instead of focusing on this idea of something out there or this concept of, oneness of whatever that means tangibly, and it's, focusing on something that you can't see or touch or taste, or the unmanifest, if you will, or, an attribute. When you focus on oneness like that, then it's something that you are trying to make real, essentially. Whereas non-duality is focused on the thing, the pointing to the thing that's creating that unrealness in the first place, or creating meaning in the first place, and saying, is that true? So instead of like an addition, it's a negation. So when you think of oneness, it's an added idea that permeates and incorporates everything, but it's an additional belief. Whereas non-duality is a negation, which is the taking away of the beliefs that are already there. And so to some extent, it's kind of like coming from different ends of the spectrum and trying to get to the same place. But when the reason why I like the topic of non-duality better is because it takes how we relate to the world and reality as humans into account, and has the ability to point out the traps that are already inherent or already exist, versus having the mind do what it already does and create this whole other world of oneness that we are supposed to believe, and then believe other things on top of that, make judgments about life. Non-duality questions all of that. And so when you peel back everything, then you find what's beneath the surface. And it's kind of like, good morning, Daryl. Daryl says, good morning, Russ. I have no volume. Is it my end? I believe that my little volume bar is showing that I'm making sounds. So it may be your end. So as I go into the next part of this, I did want to go back and read the questions that kind of led to this focus of this discussion. And this is from Lewis Smith. Lewis says, "Forgive me, I am still confused on the idea of non-duality. Is non-duality stillness of mind, or having no awareness of thought, or just ignoring your thoughts, or getting rid of thoughts, or balance? Again, thank you for your wonderful channel. Absolutely love your insight. Have a beautiful and blissful rest of your day." So you can see kind of the questions that spurred the desire to have this discussion. But isn't desire a bad thing? Once you become non-dual and enlightened, all of that fades away. And that's where I think people that come to any sort of discussion of these types of topics, spiritual ideas, even non-duality, there's this idea of wanting to change something or become something that you're not. And when you look at the questions that Lewis posed, is it stillness of the mind? Is it this? Is it getting rid of the mind, dropping the ego, that sort of thing? It's none of that, ultimately. Because what is that? If your mind becomes still, or your ego falls away, or you see the world in in a true sense, or whatever that looks like, that is all happening on a time frame. That's all happening in time. And it's a change of appearance. And so there's never really a solid thing that you can really grasp as far as this is me, this is who this is, because it's constantly changing. And so when you look at life that is constantly in flux, constantly moving, constantly changing, never sit still, to hitch your wagon of desire onto this idea that somehow the future is going to be, I don't have an ego anymore, or my mind is still and doesn't race, or I don't have anxiety. That is trying to, build your house on sand, essentially, because you're trying to link it to a change in appearance, a change in what constantly is in motion, what is animated. And that's the focus of what people are looking for in a lot of ways with non-duality, is that they want to see something manifest in their life that's different than what is currently now. And so it's all about a change in illusion, a change in appearance, and yet that desire is still more of the same. It's still more of the focus on the illusion itself, or the seeming reality that we live in. Whereas non-duality is not about seeing a different reality, it's realizing what is. And so it's not about being a different person, or becoming, more evolved, or getting a new level of development or whatever. It's an aspect or description of life or reality, and a recognition of the infinite love that we exist in. And it's kind of like so here's kind of a way to think about it, that maybe you haven't considered, that could be helpful in a way to point to. And it's not showing you what non-duality is, but yet again, it's pointing to maybe the habits, or the mental constructs that you have built, that maybe are standing in the way of the message, if you will. And so the question is, who are you, or who am I? Like, how do you define yourself? And I've talked about this at length in other videos. But let's pretend that I give you an assignment. And your assignment is, it's kind of like the idea of giving an elevator speech. And so what is an elevator speech? It's the idea that, let's say you're selling a product or a service, or you're trying to convince someone of something, you're trying to influence someone, and you get onto an elevator, and this person comes in the elevator with you, and you have only so much time to try to make that argument or that connection with that person before the elevator doors open and you get to the floor that you were intending on going to, and the interaction is over with. That's kind of the idea of what an elevator speech is. So let's say you have 30 seconds or 2 minutes or so to describe who you are as a person as an elevator speech. But instead of having the elevator move or have any time in the elevator, imagine trying to define or describe who you are with 0 seconds. So your speech is no time at all. There's no time to make the speech. How would you define who you are? So if I were to try to describe that in 30 seconds or 2 minutes, I could use words or try to make analogies or whatever, or point to things to say, this is who I am. I'm this body, I'm this person, or I was born here, this is my name. But if you have 0 seconds to make that definition of who you are, what are you left with? Like, who are you at that time? You don't have the time to define yourself. And so that's kind of how non-duality is pointing to the idea that when you're constantly in flux, if you have no time to point, because all of a sudden you point and say, that's me, that's who I am, right there, look, that's me. You're no longer that person. And it's kind of like, if you think about time, in a sense, there's a sense that you are who you are. But if someone were to point to you as a baby or as a 10-year-old or, into the future as an older person, and they would say, that's you. It's like, well, yeah, that's me, but that's not really me. It kind of gets the idea of like time travel and stuff, but it's not really you. It's it's something that maybe was you, but now is not. And so the moment you try to really hold down or control or define who you are, you're no longer that. It's like holding sand. It just goes through your fingers. You can't grasp it. So when there's something in appearance that is constantly in flux, when this concept of who you are, it's constantly moving, you have no time to define it because it's constantly changing and it's no longer you. You're no longer the same person. You're no longer in the same space. Your cells are different. You're breathing different. You're the space that you take up is different. My hand was here, now it's here. It's all constantly changing, and so there's nothing that you can really define as who you are. And that's where, if you're trying to tie your horse or hitch your wagon onto this idea of becoming a non-ego person or a person that doesn't worry about stuff or never gets angry or doesn't have any desires, that's just a story in a way that you're telling yourself that you want to become, and then it all takes place in time. Whereas what is the reality that we live in, the infinite, the absolute, is always ever present. It's not something that changes. And so what happens after you die? That's the concern of the thing that changes, that which believes itself to be real, that is constantly in flux. So when you're coming to the subject of non-duality and you're trying to change or become or understand, what you're doing is it's the same person, it's the same energy, it's the same aspect of your psyche, of your mind that is trying to free itself. So the same thing that wants to find peace or freedom, however you want to define it, relief from stress, relief from pain and suffering, the same thing that wants to have that is the thing that's creating that, essentially. So that which is creating the suffering is, I guess, disingenuous and less, to some extent, naive or ignorant of the fact that that's what's going on. But the same thing that wants peace, that wants freedom, is the same thing that is creating the separation, the stress. And so when you're asking questions like Lewis was saying, what is non-duality? Is it stillness of the mind? Is it getting rid of the ego, getting rid of the mind? It's none of that. And the thing that is seeking that is the same thing that is creating the need for those questions. So that's kind of the catch-22. But I guess when you recognize that, so you're pointing to using non-duality and pointing to the thing that is creating the illusion, if you will, versus oneness of saying everything is one. Because who is saying everything is one? It's the same thing that's saying that you're separate. So there's this need to define, control, dictate what life is. And so the thing that says, we're all one, we're all in this together, we're all this and that, we're all one family, that is the same thing that is, let's say before, has been saying, you're not good enough, you're separate, you're not at peace, life is tough, life is a struggle. The same thing that wants to define the world as one is the same thing that creates the separation. So it never wants to be looked at itself. It never wants to have the mirror held up to it. And because that's where that's where you see it for what it is, and that's the pointer to non-duality. And yet people come to this subject and they want to gain something, and they want to have this new belief or this idea. And so they add more things onto their current existing worldview. And that's just kind of another story, essentially, that we tell ourselves, versus kind of using what the concept of non-duality is providing as far as a negation of things. And so on top of that, I've said this before in other videos, is there's not really it's like a complete negation. It's not a negation of your ego or your belief system, because then that is a change in appearance. That's something that is being destroyed or dismantled. It's a complete negation in the sense that there is no need to dismantle or destroy any of that. So the truth of non-duality supports and holds everything that is, that seems to exist. So if there is an ego, if there is anxiety, if there is pain and suffering, or there's a belief system, there's nothing that needs to be gotten rid of in the sense of non-duality. So you have to take it all the way. If you go part of the way, it becomes another belief system or some sort of practice or mantra that you have to tell yourself. Whereas you realize that everything is dismantled, that means nothing is dismantled. And so there's no reason to tear anything down, because it is what is. Does that make sense? It won't make sense to someone that wants to create meaning or wants to change something. And that's fine. So that it's like the radical acceptance that I talked about in another video. It's the idea that you don't have to get rid of your ego. You don't have to have a still mind, because that's all about you and your experience and what that wants to be in the future, what you want to change about it, how you want to live your life. And it's all about your change. And if all of a sudden I were to claim that I'm this, holier than thou person that has no problems and doesn't worry about things and no issues, or I don't get angry, or I don't act like a, not nice person at times, number one, that's not being genuine. But at the same time, if I were to say that I am now this evolved, enlightened being, then that would assume that there are other peoples that aren't that. So that idea that there's some guru or some person that has this all figured out, and then they have no desire and all that, they're not human, essentially, then it creates a duality of that person versus everyone else, essentially. And that's where, in a sense, that's where we are in this together, where it's not about obtaining anything. It's not about all of a sudden having this epiphany that lasts forever, and that you're now perfect. It's seeing that you're perfect for how you are. It's seeing the love and divinity in all things, in everything, and in all people. And it's also recognizing, the fact that there's no um, there still will be hate and aggression in the world. There still will be judgment, and there's no there's no there's no belief to say that everything has to be, kumbaya, kittens and puppies. That, if somehow you are judgmental or crabby or spiteful kind of a person, that now you're not living up to your belief in non-duality. Whereas if that's what happens, that's what appears to happen. And it's not that you have to accept everything that's perceived as negative or allow everything to happen. It's not like it's saying that there are ultimately no boundaries within boundaries. And so you see things for what they are. And so there are boundaries. There are, instead of being a pool of mush on the ground, I have a structure, I have bone structure, I have internal organs, I have a brain, I have a body, skin, everything holding it in together in order to communicate this as a human being. And so there are boundaries, borders, and structures there. And that's not saying that we need to get rid of all that, because then there would be nothing. It would just be, there would be no manifestation, essentially. So there is an appearance of a manifested 3D objective world. And so there are boundaries, borders. So it's like to claim that having good boundaries is somehow bad because we're all one. There's all this oneness. It's just a belief system saying that my idea of the world is better than yours. So if you don't agree with me, then you're a bad person, essentially. Whereas non-duality is not saying don't have boundaries, don't have borders, don't have, respect for your own personal space or your own time, or having private property or anything like that, or having national borders or boundaries, that sort of thing. Putting a lock on your door, it's not saying that we need to get rid of all that, because then that would be a prescription for how to live life. And that's not what non-duality is all about. And that's what makes it unique and special. That's why I like talking about it, because it's not a message you'll hear anywhere else. So I covered my Post-it notes. So yeah. So if you have any other questions or comments, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about when it comes to what non-duality is really. It's none of the things you think it is, but it's everything. It's kind of that frustrating concept, because once you get it, you see the special nature of the concept, the uniqueness of it. But at the same time, you see the mundacity, is that the right word? The mundaneness of the everydayness of the concept, the fact that you're not getting anything out of it. And just there can be a reaction to that, a frustration about that, because you are trying to get something. It's any sort of, if you deal with rejection in life, you want that job, or you want that that person you meet, and you want to have a relationship with them, and ultimately you get you get the shaft, you get you get rejected. It can be painful, and because it's something that you're seeking, and all of a sudden you're not getting what you want, so your desire is not met. And that can be something you don't enjoy. And so part of this is, the frustration of learning, like, that's what I've been spending all this time trying to figure out. That's what I'm seeking, is that we give life all the meaning that it has. And I'm creating the solution essentially. And I'm not getting anything out of this. But, then there's this belief that now I have figured that out and it becomes a concept. So I finally get what Russ is saying, finally get what Lisa Carnes is saying, what Tony Parsons is saying, finally get what Paul Harriman is saying, or whoever. And then it's like, oh, okay, well, now I get it. Now I can talk about it. But that doesn't change anything about life, essentially. And so you can put on all the trappings, all the, I could put the big, rug or design behind me with like the circle, the pattern of the kind of the sun, the illuminated symbol behind my head. And I can wear a certain kind of clothing and present myself in certain ways, which I've done in other videos, which is pretty fun to do. But none of that has any real meaning. And so if you're thinking like, oh, I'm this special person now because I have it all figured out, because I understand non-duality, it's like, well, life comes as it does. And this thing that you have, that you say, well, now I'm in control, now I have this all figured out, then there's something else that comes along that throws a monkey wrench, that puts you back in your place. It's I think, that's part of the discussion that they were talking about in on the Eagle Brook Church sermon today. It was this idea of the connection between pride and anxiety, and this idea that you can control, and this lack of humility, thinking that you can, basically take the reins and do it all yourself, and how that ultimately fails. And so if you think you have non-duality all figured out, now life's going to be smooth sailing, something comes along, you lose your job, you lose a loved one, you lose a relationship, you get into financial problems, and all of a sudden this whole idea of non-duality that you seem to figure out didn't really have as much meaning, because now you're having to deal with this particular issue that you didn't see coming. And life has a way, God has a way of making us humble, whether we like it or not. And you can take those, people call them signposts, or symbols, or things that life points in your way that, if you pay attention to, then that's something that you can learn and grow. And so in addition to non-duality not giving anything to you or providing any sort of relief or understanding, it's just a description of reality, essentially. There are ways, we as human beings, we grow and evolve and adapt. And so there are ways and things that can help you and help you develop. And part of that is being humble, asking for forgiveness, being a meek person, not weak person, a meek person. And, there are things that can help, practices and meditations perhaps, but all of that has nothing to do with this topic. And part of the difficulty of talking about non-duality is oftentimes speakers conflate giving a description of non-duality and a prescription, or a story of life, or how to live life, or a moral, ethical code, that sort of thing. So we have all of that. That's part of life, but non-duality has everything to do with that and nothing to do with that. But the tough part is when you talk about, that's why I don't necessarily get into my specific circumstances or my life or my story, not because there's anything wrong with stories, and perhaps that's something I should be doing because it's something that people connect with. That's what people are looking for, is that as human beings, we tell truths, meaning we provide each other with stories, and that's how we communicate. But part of that, the reason why speakers of non-duality don't get into it oftentimes, because it can cloud, it can muddy up the waters of the message of non-duality. And I was my last, well, I'm gonna hold that thought. I'm gonna get a little bit more coffee and I'll continue on. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave it. Okay. In my last live talk I did last week, one of the commenters did a little plug of a couple other ideas, I guess specifically the law of one, and one of the individuals who focuses on that teaching, and his name is Aaron Abke, Abke. So I definitely am not versed in any of that, so it's fairly new to me, and so I'm not really going to have a strong opinion on it one way or the other. But I guess for what it's worth, I can give you my initial take on it, or my initial reaction to it, because in the videos that I saw, Aaron talks about a little bit about non-duality and stuff like that, but more of the focus is on this channeled teaching from an entity or entities called Ra. And so this was done in the 80s, and so it talks, I'm not going to get into it specifically because it is not my expertise. I don't know much about it, but there's essentially a thing called Book of Ra, and it talks about the law of one and kind of what that means. And he goes into this idea of kind of levels of spiritual development and densities. So like we're in a third density, is kind of based on the chakra system and how the earth is changing and yada yada. And so that's kind of a good example of what I'm referring to as far as the message of non-duality, and then another kind of description of life for how the world works or where we are as human beings. And it can kind of get mixed up in that. And so the reason why I like non-duality is because it points to kind of what is already manifesting, or what has appeared. And so you learn from history, or you repeat it. And life obviously is cyclical in a lot of ways. But I like things, when you talk about human development, looking at how we've changed as societies and cultures throughout time, like spiral dynamics. And, Ken Wilber talks about a lot of this. And so it kind of points to things that we're already familiar with. And for me, one of the big ones that kind of started me down this process, like I've mentioned in other videos, is the Enneagram, pointing to the personality structures of who we believe ourselves to be, and showing that we're maybe not as original or unique as we thought we were, because we're, in a sense, living a script. We're kind of acting life because of the innate habits or structures in our psyche that are already there, that we don't have consciousness of, or awareness of, that we thought we were in control, making decisions, and all of a sudden we're like, oh, wait, who's making the decisions here? I thought that was me. It's a program. It's something that I was born into. It's something that is beyond my perceivable control. And that's where I like some of those types of teachings, because it points to that which already seems to be, and shows the falseness of it. When you get into the idea of the like Palladians, or Ra, or the Anunnaki, or any of like kind of the alien interactions with humans and all this other stuff, and how this is what life's going to be in 10,000 years, because we're shifting from electrochemical to light beings, and what that really means. It's, there's a benefit of logic and rationality. There's also a limit to logic and rationality. And so when it comes to these types of discussions of where we are going as human beings, and kind of where we are in this big grand scheme of things, there's a lot of intuition there, which may or may not be true, and it may be beneficial or not. Yet at the same time, it could be, something that's real, that's something that we're moving towards, but it could be something that is just another kind of new agey type of idea that is just something that makes people feel good. And so I'm not disparaging, I'm not trying to disparage, especially when I'm not as well versed on the subject of the Law of One and the Book of Ra and that sort of thing. But if you listen to it, it's a big story. It's something that's being told, and that's how we're, as humans, we create meaning. And so that's just part of any sort of religious type of community, if you will. It's looking at, where we are as something bigger than life. Like what is life other than this just mundane life that we live? How are we connected to the cosmos in a bigger, grander scheme, a bigger story, if you will? How do we connect to that? And yet, I guess part of my mindset looks at that from a logical standpoint, because that's how my mind works. And, the BS meter goes off in certain respects, but yet I don't hold that to be necessarily true. Like I don't necessarily think that I'm right and Aaron Abke's wrong in that sense. But when it comes to, okay, so the idea that you're somehow transitioning to a light body, like where is the evidence of that? How does that process work? And when you push the culmination, the proof into the future, if you say it's tens of thousands of years from now that the Earth is going to be more of a fourth dimensional situation where we are more light body than we are electrochemical. We're less meat suit, as Aaron says, and we're more, higher level of being and interacting, higher level of our consciousness can flow through us in a freer way. Then it's like, the question that was posed to him was, are we going to be able to experience that? It's like, well, yes, as humans, but it's going to be in your, 50,000th reincarnation that you're going to be now a light being. And so it's like, oh, okay, I guess I'll wait till that happens in 50,000 years, and then you'll be proven correct. So it's funny in the sense that it's like with non-duality, it's, you have science and non-duality, but there's science of science and science of the 3D world of what we live in, and there's a scientific approach to looking at the inner world, and yet there's no science that ultimately prove non-duality, because it's always to some extent theoretical. And so when so it's kind of hard to disparage what the law of one or whatever is pointing at, because non-duality kind of has similar aspects to it. But when you can't, when it's going to be something way off into the future and you just have to trust me or believe me, it's like, well, okay, then it's a belief in a story. It's not necessarily having faith. It's not necessarily true from a scientific or logical standpoint. And it just becomes something that, makes you want to feel like you're connected. And I guess if you find benefit or relief from that, I guess, in that way, it's a good thing, but it's, is it true? Can you be 100% certain, absolutely sure that it's true? I mean, it interweaves some of the understandings we currently have, but then it gets into things that we may or may not understand. And so, in that respect, it's interesting. I like the idea of it, but, how much weight do I put into it? How much stock do I put into it? I don't know. I've seen people talk about reptilians and how, they're walking among us because they can shapeshift, or they can enter into the energy, can enter into human form. And oftentimes it's like, David Icke is one that talks about that, seen as a negative thing. But then I've also seen other people talk about the reptilians as an elite, higher consciousness that's here to serve and all that, similar to Ra, if you will, or light beings that come and manifest, or, come onto Earth and try to help. And it's all about, development in a spiritual sense. And that's all well and good. It's just, is that how it really works? I don't know. So that's my initial take on the law of one and all of that. Do I know if it's true? I don't know. Does it sound kind of cool? Maybe. And again, it goes to the idea of, don't have too much of an open mind, otherwise your brain falls out or something like that. I mean, I think you can be open to ideas and open to experience, open to life, but at the same time, there's discernment. You have to have discernment, intuition, if you will. because otherwise you're just falling for anything. And if you take non-duality as everything is what it is, and I don't have to have an opinion or do anything, then you're not standing for anything and you're falling for everything. Which is kind of a cliche statement, but I think there's some truth to it. I did want to read a little bit from the book of Proverbs. A couple verses. Proverbs verse 11 says, "The Lord abhors dishonest scales, but accurate weights are his delight. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom." So that was Proverbs verse 1, or chapter 11, verse 1 and 2. And another couple verses from Proverbs chapter 11 is, let's see, 19 through 21. "The truly righteous man obtains life, but he who pursues evil goes to his death. The Lord detests men of perverse heart, but he delights in those whose ways are blameless. Be sure of this, the wicked will not go unpunished, but those who are righteous will go free." Be sure of that. What goes around comes around. Sometimes it just takes time. But the truth is already there. You can't escape it, I guess, in a way. You can ask for forgiveness. It's kind of quiet today. Anyone have any comments or questions? If you're on watching live here and you're just like, I just don't know if I want to say something because, what if I say it the wrong way, or, I don't know how Russ is going to react to it. Just write something. So it appears as there's a couple people watching. So, maybe you have this on your big screen in your living room and you can't really type in a comment or a question, but No, your screen's not frozen. I'm just sitting here. What am I waiting for? I think I'm waiting for Godot. So let's see, I started about 17 after. It's been a little over an hour. I guess I can wrap it up here in a minute unless you have any other quick comments or questions. I'll leave you with this. This is from Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.